extend further south and east across the rest of the UK. So on balance, it's not going to be as cold to take us into Wednesday morning as it was for the first couple of mornings this week, although the far southeast and parts of East Anglia may just see the odd pocket of frost to take us into Wednesday morning. Otherwise, Wednesday, for the most part, is a cloudier day, and this area of rain will be slowly working its way from northwest to southeast of the day. It's going to be painful old progress. It's going to be slow, and for a good part of southern and eastern England, probably staying dry throughout daylight hours. A bit more unsettled then midweek with these frontal systems trudging their way across the country. A bit of uncertainty as to how quickly this clears away from the east on Thursday. But by Good Friday, pressure starting to build back in. So hopefully a fine end to the week after a couple of fairly wet, more unsettled days. Dry conditions by Friday and temperatures in the low teens.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, Nana, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit up.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you.
She's only teasing. Go on.
He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion.
Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m.
as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg. State of the Nation tonight. Brexit Britain prevails despite Remain of Wales. His Majesty's government has entered the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Britain has entered a trade bloc which is projected to make up a quarter of the world's GDP by 2050. Vale Europe, let's be specific, the future's the Pacific. A win for the victims of grooming gangs. The government has announced a special police task force, amongst other measures, to tackle the unsolved problem. And the Home Secretary has told GB News, the People's Channel, it isn't racist to tell the truth. And were you hoping to get your new and beautiful dark blue passport, freed from the tyrannical maroon red of the European Union? Well, think again. The Passport Office has gone on strike, picketing their own homes, I can only assume, but we'll be diving into government efficiency shortly. State of the Nation starts now. We'll also be hearing from our acclaimed panel, the cantankerous historian, David Starkey, and the incorrigible socialist, Stephen Pound. As ever, I want to hear from you. It doesn't cost much to keep in touch. International direct emailing, mailmog@gbnews.uk. Well now, that's your amuse-bouche. It's time for your meat and potatoes with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to our top story on GB News tonight. The man who murdered Olivia Pratt-Corbell in Liverpool has been sentenced to life in prison today. He'll serve a minimum of 42 years. Thomas Cashman shot the 9-year-old girl as he chased a convicted drug dealer into her home in August last year. Outside the court, the schoolgirl's mother, Cheryl Corbell, said her family has already started their life sentence, having to spend the rest of their lives without Olivia.
Liv was the light of our lives, a sassy, chatty girl who never ran out of energy. She was a character. She was my baby, and she had amazing qualities and knew what she wanted in life. Everyone adored her. She was the baby of our family, and my little love, my shadow. Now everything we do and everywhere we go is a constant reminder that she is not there with us. All that promise for her future so cruelly taken away.
Now, the Prime Minister, as you've been hearing, has announced a new task force to crack down on grooming gangs in the UK. Rishi Sunak said the new measures aim to prevent victims and whistleblowers from being ignored by the authorities because of cultural sensitivities or political correctness. And that's after the Home Secretary singled out British Pakistani men as a particular concern. Speaking exclusively to GB News, Suella Braverman said her comments on Pakistani men were based on reviews and reports.
It's not racist to tell the truth about what has been going on here in Rochdale or in Rotherham or in Telford. Local reviews and reports have confirmed that the grooming gangs scandal that has gone on here has been perpetrated by largely British Pakistani men. Now, it's important not to demonise a whole community, and the vast majority of British Pakistanis are law-abiding and straightforward people.
In other news today, the brother of the television presenter Philip Schofield has been found guilty of sexually abusing a teenage boy. Timothy Schofield was charged with 11 offences involving a child between October 2016 and October 2019. The 54-year-old has been remanded in custody and will be sentenced next month. Reacting to the verdict, his brother Philip Schofield said, "As far as I'm concerned, I no longer have a brother." Teachers in England will go on strike for another 2 days next term after rejecting the latest government pay offer. They'll walk out on the 27th of April and the 2nd of May. 98% of NEU members voted against what they described as an insulting offer of a £1,000 one-off payment plus an average of a 4.5% rise for most staff next year. And Donald Trump is still on his way to New York, where he's due to appear in court. We're keeping an eye on his plane for you. The former US president's been indicted in relation to alleged hush money payments to the adult film star Stormy Daniels before the 2016 election. Mr. Trump, when he gets to Manhattan, will be arraigned, fingerprinted and photographed at the court. His lawyer says he's going to enter a plea of not guilty. He's also due to speak in Florida tomorrow. We're keeping tabs on that story for you, as I said, right here on GB News. You are up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and on the TuneIn app. This is the People's Channel. Back now to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, we'll call it TPP for short, has now seen the UK join. And it will see Brexit Britain entering a trading bloc made up of 11 nations, now constituting over 15% of global commerce, the same as the 27 EU member states. A mix of Commonwealth states, Asian and South American countries. It includes behemoths like Japan, but our friends like Australia and Canada and developing countries like Peru and Malaysia, where there's real strong economic growth. CPTPP slashes tariffs on at least 95% of goods between members, and the bloc's projected to make up a quarter of the globe's GDP by 2050. At that point, the EU is projected to make up only 10%. So it's set up as a real opportunity for us to trade and to make progress in the Pacific. And we'll have to see what happens with countries like China and, of course, the United States, which are also interested in this bloc. But critics have already begun wailing, which is perhaps in itself a Brexit benefit. They're claiming we should just stayed in the EU if we were going to join another trading bloc. But this isn't like the EU. First of all, as I've said already, it's a fast growth area where the EU is sluggish. But the TPP will not pass laws. It's not looking to have a political union. There won't be an unelected body that decides how we're regulated, and it won't have its own central bank or its own currency. We're not going to have to adopt the yen in years to come or the Australian dollar. And it won't have freedom of movement. We will be remaining subject to our own immigration laws. There's no question of ever closer political union, and there won't be a national anthem and a flag and all the titbits that have gone with the European Union. I mean, if they did want a national anthem, they could always have Rule Britannia, but they're not going down that route. Now, critics have said that there was a Whitehall forecast that suggested growth from TPP would only boost our GDP by 0.08%. But this forecast is from a gravity model, and the history of gravity models is pretty poor. Andrew Rose of UC Berkeley used the very same model to predict that Britain's trade would grow for 300% from joining the euro. He then revised it to say it would be a little under 200%, but nonetheless, of all the silly forecasts you could have made on a gravity model, that was one of the silliest. Actually, trade boosts every country that adopts free trade and always has done. This is an enormous opportunity, but it will also embed divergence within the UK, so the chance of a future government taking us back into shadowing, copying the EU becomes much lower because we've agreed now to have freer trade with a big and growing economic bloc. This is really exciting, and the chance for economic development is enormous. But as always, I want to know what you at home think. Please get in touch. Email me at mailmog@gbnews.uk. But I'm really pleased to be joined this evening by, I think I can call her the High Priestess of Remainers, Gina Miller. Gina, you've been so instrumental, so much part of the Brexit campaign since the referendum and beyond. What are your thoughts on the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Do you think it is sensible for the UK to be going down this route, or are you concerned about our change of focus away from the EU?
I don't think it's about the EU at all. I think it's about choices that we're making. We've left, we've Brexited, and I can't see that we're going back in any time soon, any generation soon. So it's now about what do we want as a country? What are the political choices that our government is making? And I think they've made, in this deal, it very clear the vision that they have for our country, your government's vision for the country. And it's one that's anti-consumer, it's one that's anti-protection, it's one where the people who are a small group, a minority of people who do well from services, the services industry, will continue to do well. And environmentally, you've basically just trashed all the agreements and the promises you made in Glasgow at the climate. I
can see it's anti-protection, and so it should be, because protectionism is damaging for economies.
It's not when it's consumer protection.
How is it anti-consumer?
It is anti-consumer because what you've basically done in this deal is you've given manufacturers, producers, the right to self-certify on products to see if they're safe or not.
What's dangerous about Japan? Come on, one of the highest standards of any country in the world.
Well, I'm talking about what we will do here in the UK. You've also
we'll import from Japan, but Japan has standards the least as high as ours.
Yes,
what's the danger? What's the risk?
So the countries who have higher standards than ours, their whole idea of taking back control, we will have to agree to those higher standards. We can't actually diverge as much as you say, because those areas that have high standards, we will have to sign up to that, because this is just about trade. You spoke earlier about the whole European Union. The CPTPP is just a trading bloc.
Yes.
That's all it is.
That's all we want. If we'd had that with the EU, we might have stayed in it.
But there is a price to pay. And we've made an environmental price to pay in this, and we've also made a consumer price to pay, in my view, in that we're lowering standards.
For example, can you give evidence for lowering standards? I am going to
give you evidence. So, for example, we will have food. You've basically sold out our farmers, the British farmers, again, as you did in the Australian trade deal, because what we will have is people in the UK will have cheaper food, probably, but it will be food that will have pesticides that we've outlawed in the UK. It will have hormones in beef. You know, these are things that don't keep people safe.
Food will have to be safe to UK standards to be sold in the UK. That's part of the agreement.
Yeah, but to agree, you have now reduced the standards to say that we can bring.
We haven't.
Speak
Retail
to the
standards will
National
remain the
Union of
same.
Farmers. They don't agree with you, and they are the farming union. So I'd imagine
they've
they would know.
welcomed the agreement.
Not from anything I've read and spoken to them, they haven't.
Minette Batters was in the paper welcoming it at the weekend.
What they've said is that you've sold out British farmers. But let's move on to the environment, because this is really important.
Let's get your point on cheaper food. Isn't cheaper food a good thing for British consumers? We're in a cost of living crisis, don't we want...
Oh, absolutely. No, I think, you know, if you think about it from your and Mr Sunak's, for example, the Prime Minister's point of view, around your table, your children won't have to worry about what's in the food because you'll be able to afford the high-quality food because you've got a rich table. But what about everybody else? What about people who, you say cost of living crisis, what they're going to be having is lower-quality food that's not as safe. And that is actually...
On what basis is it low quality? Japan has the highest quality food of anywhere in the world. Australia has extremely high quality food.
Sorry, in Australia, we already know from the trade deal.
When you go to Australia, do you eat the food in Australia?
No, we already know.
When you go to Australia, do you eat the food there?
Yes, I do.
So what danger has that been to you?
Well, what it means is you have choice. I'm not saying you don't have choice. What you're saying is that people who have a lower cost of living and need lower food.
They'll have cheaper food from Australia, which is very high quality food.
But it's not what the trade agreement says. It's not what British farmers are saying. It's not what the farmers...
That's protectionism, but protectionism puts up prices for the average consumer and makes people poorer.
But it does also mean that we protect our standards, and that's what's so important. The reason we have spent years improving our standards in food, in water, in the environment, etc., is because we believe we should keep our population safer, that they should have access to proper food.
But the partnership won't change our water standards.
No, it won't. No, I was just giving you an example. No, the water standards are separate. I'm just saying we fought to make these things higher.
But the EU standards were about protectionism for EU production, not for safety for consumers. They put up prices and costs for consumers because they were process standards rather than outcome standards. What we'll be doing in the Trans-Pacific Partnership is outcome standards.
They were both. And when you say about control, well, the other thing is, in signing this deal, we have given, you know, the whole idea of taking back control is that we've actually given over to corporate lobbyists the ability to hold our government to account in very secretive courts. We already know from the CPTPP members, such an acronym that there are something like 64 cases against their governments. You've got a Canadian company who's now taking a case against the Biden administration for the cancellation of the Keyline XL line because of the environmental damage. So, you know, you're giving corporate entities a huge amount of power in this deal.
Those situations have been true in trade deals going back for years and years and have been narrowed in their scope in recent deals, not widened. So that's actually more protection in the UK.
No, but these are secretive courts, so we won't have any say in.
The agreements on standards are public. Standards the UK has are public. And you know about this case between Canada and the US, so
yes,
that's clearly public.
Yes, it's still public. What I'm saying is that you have corporate lobbyists who will be able to sue governments if they think that the environmental standards they're bringing are somehow unfair to them as businesses.
But they have no ability to enforce that. Whereas if they're corporate lobbyists in the EU, like the German car manufacturers who made us all have diesel cars to huge damage, they get that made law across the EU, which is directly enforceable. In trade agreements, any agreement then has to be enforced by our own Parliament and our own courts.
Yes,
so there's
but
much more protection.
These secretive courts that happen that the CPTPP has.
Yeah, let's just call it the TPP.
Let's call it TPP. It is much easier. I don't know. The longer bit is far too difficult. they're already making agreements that we don't know about, and we don't know why they're making those agreements. These courts are not open to scrutiny.
But any change in regulation is open to scrutiny as a matter for debate, and this is the whole point of Brexit. It's all about public.
I'm really pleased you brought that
accountability.
Up. Because, exactly, parliamentary sovereignty, accountability is paramount in my view, and I think you believe the same. So why was the parliamentary committee that actually is there to scrutinise such treaties as the TPP abolished last week?
Well, any change in domestic law has to be introduced through Parliament.
Why was the committee
cancelled?
Because
we have a dualist system, as you know perfectly well, that we have the ability of the government to sign treaties, but it only becomes effective in UK law if it's passed by Parliament.
Yes.
So Parliament always has the right to stop any treaty agreement.
Parliament doesn't have the ability now to scrutinise. The committee won't have the ability to scrutinise it. And the way your government has been using, your government putting votes in, they don't have time to scrutinise a lot of what's going through Parliament.
But this is merely the change you're talking about is simply because the Department of International Trade has been merged with the Department of Business. So the Department of Business and International Trade.
That's not a reason to get rid of a committee that scrutinises
that
treaties.
committee's still there. It's just got a different name. It's now the Department of Business and International Trade. This committee hasn't got at all.
This was a committee, and this was not a department.
That select committee remains just been renamed. Unfortunately, we've got to move on, but I hope you'll come back on again to have further discussions. Thank you very much to Gina. Don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.uk. Coming up, His Majesty's Government has pledged new measures to tackle grooming gangs, a victory for the People's Channel. And later, at the start of the First World War, just 175 staff, including doorkeepers, made up the Foreign Office. How many workers are there in the Foreign Office today? All will be revealed shortly.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
You're an inspiration to us all.
Clip that bit off.
Well, you are.
That's my ringtone. My political ambitions those days are gone, I can tell you. She's only teasing. Go on. He's probably going to want to lay down now. I'll give him 2 minutes to have one. Let's respectfully disagree. That's what we like on Jubes and Kerr. Come and join us. GB News, the People's Channel.
Michelle Dewberry, weekday evenings at 6 o'clock.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me.
So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We've got a brand new lineup every Saturday night on GB News.
From 6 p.m, I'll give you my unique take on the world today.
Then at 7, it's me, Calvin Robinson, with my Common Sense Crusade.
New to GB News is the Saturday 5.
5 times the opinion. Join us every Saturday from 8 p.m. as we debate the week's stories.
With us 4, plus a special guest.
And at 9, of course, it's Mark Dolan Tonight. Brand new Saturday nights on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Duncan says the CPTPP sounds like a better version of the common market. Spot on, as it used to be called before the Maastricht Treaty spoilt everything. I think that's absolutely right. I think we'd have stayed in a common market. Mick says the new trade deal is terrific. The EU is stagnant and on a downward path. We're looking up, and Remainers like Gina Miller just make up their objections off the top of their heads with no evidence whatsoever. And another view, I think CPTPP is a better trading bloc as we are growing fast and it doesn't have political influence over us. Thank you for those. The report into grooming gangs in Telford in Shropshire seemed to tell an all too familiar story. Groups of men of largely Pakistani heritage sexually abused young girls for years, while authorities who were fearful of appearing racist stood by and did nothing. In 2013, an independent inquiry into the Rotherham groomings was investigated. It found that at least 1,400 children had been subjected to sexual abuse between 1997 and 2013. The Home Secretary spoke to GB News earlier today, and here's what she had to say.
Not racist to tell the truth about what has been going on here in Rochdale or in Rotherham or in Telford. Local reviews and reports have confirmed that the grooming gangs scandal that has gone on here has been perpetrated by largely British Pakistani men. Now, it's important not to demonise a whole community, and the vast majority of British Pakistanis are law-abiding and straightforward people.
I'm joined now by GB News' Investigates reporter, the man behind the GB News documentary Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame, whose policy proposals are actually being adopted by the government. Charlie Peters. Charlie, thank you. I mean, you have spent so much time on this, and isn't it extraordinary that 10 years after the Rotherham scandal, we're still repeating these investigations and finding that the same mistakes were made?
Yes, indeed, and that was really the motivation for launching my investigation. I felt that we never really had the national conversation we needed when the lid blew off this scandal 10 years ago. And indeed, a lot of the conversation I've seen in reaction to the policies announced by the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary have confirmed that there's still some way to go. Lots of the reactions being rather meek and tame, and people accusing the Home Secretary of being racist for providing new task forces and policies for tackling the gangs. Well, what I witnessed today was I met with several of the survivors who've been working with GB News and who also met with the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary this morning. And for the first time in almost 2 years of working with these survivors, I saw smiles and I saw a cautious optimism and a sense of hope that for so long had not been there.
And their stories are very similar to ones we've had before, of the people who ought to have protected them not protecting them, and the authorities being very nervous of appearing to be politically incorrect if they took action against the abusers.
Correct, and that's why this National Crime Agency-supported task force is so vital. And Jacob, you said that there had been 1,400 girls abused in Rotherham between 1997 and 2013. The NCA actually revised that number up to 1,510 after it brought in its own investigation. And so the documentary I produced was very keen that the NCA would launch investigations into the other towns across the country where we know that this kind of abuse has been taking place. Because invariably, when the NCA go in, they find more survivors, they find more perpetrators, and usually they deliver more justice. So it's extremely promising to see that the government picked up on this policy proposal.
And how brave do you think the Home Secretary has been to take this up? Because it hasn't made her popular, and she, as you say, has been accused of racism for making some of the points she's made.
Well, it hasn't made her popular among the people who would always be unpopular when they looked at this issue. I mean, I think for the most of the country have been crying out for this kind of response for years. I mean, for over a decade in some places. And so, actually, I think the truth doesn't fear investigation. The Home Secretary is right to be pressing for more investigation, for more action. I think, as far as I can tell, the reaction for people across the country is enormously positive.
OK, well, thank you very much, Charlie. I understand breaking news that Donald Trump is just about to land in New York, that the pictures are just coming through. There we go. I think we can see his aeroplane coming in now. It's about to land, and the wicketkeeper, I think, is about to catch it. And let's hope he doesn't drop the plane as it comes in. With me now is my panel, the distinguished historian, Dr. David Starkey, and the former Labour MP, Stephen Pound. This story from Telford and the previous one from Rotherham is so terrible that one cannot believe that the state has failed in its primary object of keeping people safe and maintaining law and order. Stephen, you know how difficult it's been for Sarah Champion in Rotherham. Why has there been so much institutional objection to investing this level of criminality?
I think the standard Liberal response on these occasions is to say that this is not purely the South Asian grooming gang issue, but the reality is you cannot divorce this particular horror, this nightmare, this thing that in some ways it's almost worse than death for a child to be broken in this particular way. You cannot divorce it from the ethnicity of the majority of the perpetrators. You mentioned Sarah Champion, the MP for Rotherham, a woman of immense courage. When she raised this in the Labour Party in Parliament 10 years ago, I remember Lord Ahmed, who was about to be sent to the House of Lords, although he is no longer there, Lord Ahmed of Rotherham, said that there's no way that we can actually discuss this without being prejudiced, being perceived as being somehow prejudiced against, as he referred to, Pakistani taxi drivers. Look, I think fair play to Suella Braverman. She's done the right thing. She's done the brave thing here. What we have to admit is that there is a massive problem, but the question that overhangs all of this is, where were social services? Where were the parents? Where were the people who were actually supposed to be looking after these poor children? Where were the guardians ad litem? Where were the police? And I think we need to look into our own mirror on this one, but equally, the Asian community have to accept, and they've not done it so far, they simply have to accept a degree of culpability.
David, the numbers. I read out 1,400. Charlie said it's 1,510 in Rotherham. It's just unbelievable, isn't it, that this was going on and nothing was happening?
It is and it isn't. And I think Stephen has made points very eloquently and from specific knowledge. I would like to do something slightly different, if I could. I think what we have to look at is not simply dare one use a hideous word, mechanics. We've actually got to look at what the Home Secretary said. It's a question of values. We should be asking, after all, most of these communities have been in Britain now 60 years. Of that kind of order. Why do they, or important groups of them, remain so absolutely alien to British values? Why do they remain so self-contained? And I think we've got to address utterly fundamental things. It is not ethnicity. I do not actually believe that it is religion. What it is instead, you get specific clan groupings. There's been a great deal of work done on this kind of thing by a friend of mine, a great legal scholar, Patrick Nash. These communities are essentially imported en masse from specific villages on the foothills of the Punjab. When this case broke in 2013, I too was courageous. I dared to say this is a question of different values. I actually used the phrase values from the foothills of the Punjab, and I was denounced as this wicked, disgraceful racist for telling, of course, for the absolute truth. Now, what do we do about it? Why have they remained so foreign? They have remained so solidly different because of cousin marriage. It's exactly what used to happen with with our British German royal family. They married back home every generation. Because of cousin marriage, these communities, particularly the men, marry women from their own local village back in the Punjab. And this keeps this extraordinary, dare I use the word, primitivism, this set of values that regards their own women in one particular way and white women in another. And until we dare to tackle the question of cousin marriage, we will not break this, we will not break the separation of these communities, and we must tell
David,
the truth.
the problem is it's all about land back home, and it's mostly in northern Pakistan, these people, and mostly as you come towards Afghanistan and Kashmir. But look, let me just say one thing that the Labour Party has been guilty of. The Labour Party took advantage of this because the system that you refer to...
It became their party.
Much worse than that. It became a voting bloc.
Yes.
What happened was, in certain places, even places like Peterborough, you wouldn't think that, you would have a whole ward...
Tower Hamlets.
You had a whole block of people, and that the Labour Party took advantage of that, I'm afraid. But what's more worrying is the fact that we got Mandeville's a special school in my old constituency. The majority of young children in there who were born with severe disabilities are the result of cousin marriage.
We're going to have to finish with this very serious subject. Thank you both for discussing it in such a measured way. Entirely separately, Donald Trump has landed now. His plane has reached the tarmac. But I think this is a subject of such importance, I'm sure we will come back to it. Still ahead, at the outbreak of the First World War, the British Navy had 520 warships and submarines. How many admirals and warships do you think make up the Navy today? That will be revealed after these messages from our sponsors.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything, I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. I campaigned in the largest democratic vote in our island's story. I know this country has so much to be proud of. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better. The wisdom of the nation is in its people. Vox Populi, Vox Dei. That's why I'm joining the People's Channel. Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News. Welcome back to State of the Nation. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your mail mogs.
Steve says, well done to the lady, Suella Braverman. The institutions involved should be brought to justice over their failings. Shame on them. Julie says, I chose to leave the EU because I was against TTIP, which was one of the EU's biggest secrets. I'm appalled that we have now joined an equivalent model. This is big corporations writing rules for big corporations. I don't agree with Julie, but I think she makes an interesting point. Marie says, well done, Suella. At last, somebody not afraid to say it out loud. And no, she's not a racist. It's the truth. Now, we were going to have a discussion on the President of the United States, Joe Biden, causing a stir this week after saying he won't be attending the coronation of King Charles III next month, after he had been to Ulster for a photo opportunity this month. But actually, as Donald Trump has just landed, I think it may be more interesting to talk about what's going on in America and their decision to charge a former president, which has made his ratings go shooting up in the polls. Stephen, I'm going to come to you first, because do you think the Democrats have blundered and made a big mistake in going after Trump in this way?
Well, I don't entirely. It's not the Democrats, it's the district attorney in New York. I mean,
but it's a political judicial system in the States.
It is indeed. You know, they're elected, and there's some people
He's elected
who wish we had
as a Democrat.
the same thing here. However, I think that it is an error in some ways, because it is simply allow him to play the victim, to actually say that, you know, that they're all after me. But I think what's going to happen here is his personal ratings amongst Republicans are going to be sky high. His ratings amongst the population as a whole will dip, because I think most people are now just heartily sick of this charade. You know, he's going to obviously be emerging, probably wearing handcuffs, maybe even wearing a broad arrow suit. He's going to absolutely ham it up. And his day in court, you know, you think Gwyneth Paltrow, you know, was booking all the headlines when she was in court last week. You ain't seen nothing yet. It's a horrible political mistake.
Isn't this Donald Trump's stock in trade? This just sort of publicity he likes. This is free publicity for him. I mean, he couldn't have written the script better for his election campaign.
But I think, again, Jacob, we've been talking about this before when we discussed the business of arraigning Boris Johnson before the Privileges Committee of the Commons. It is lawfare. It is the use of law as a political instrument, and particularly as an attempt, in both cases, to exclude somebody from running for office again. It's an attempt at actually, because you disapprove of them, rightly or wrongly, to exclude them from the future, from the political process. And it's usually, as you said, counterproductive. But I think it goes... The point when we were discussing this in the case of Boris Johnson, I think it cuts very deeply into the nature of the democratic process. The overlay of democracy with quasi-legal forms is invariably destructive, and you confuse justice and power in the most dangerous way.
And it undermines all confidence in a justice system if it's used. And in both systems, it makes the political division much more acerbic and hostile, and it makes people doubt that there is justice.
The national conversation, you know, more corrosive and more dangerous. But I think in some ways the reason that it is a mistake is there's something very tacky and very sordid about a golf tournament in Las Vegas and a pornographic film star going up to his arena. You know, maybe I'm squeamish, but when you think the three things they could get him on, going to the governor in Georgia and just saying, you know, can you find me some more votes, taking his confidential documents down to Mar-a-Lago.
Well, Joe Biden's taken all of it.
So you're confusing. Sorry, Stephen, you're forgetting that.
I haven't even come to the third one yet.
No, it doesn't matter, because none of them apply, because they are not offences in New York. The point is, you're confusing what would be a federal prosecution, which those things that you describe are, with what is in fact a state prosecution. What is going on now, of course, is the fact that because of the separation between federal and state powers, which also extend to justice to a large extent in America, you've in fact got two levels of lawfare. One, again, very much in terms of the actual politics of New York, another in terms of national politics. Equally, it's extraordinary, isn't it? You'd have thought that Americans, who constantly go on about the separation of powers, in other words, keeping executive, judicial, legislative power separate, would actually understand this. And in fact, they've done precisely the opposite.
But the Secretary of State in Georgia could have brought the prosecution. And above all, don't forget, the District of Columbia, which is Democrat-controlled, could certainly have brought a case for incitement for the January riots in the White House.
But doesn't the governor of Texas, when Joe Biden's out of office, prosecute Joe Biden for something now?
Well, let's see what the facts are on this. We don't know what they are.
District attorney in Texas.
It's possible.
There's a certain laptop which contains vastly more information.
Are we talking about the Hunter Biden one?
Which appears to contain much more information on on... No, please.
You're privy to Hunter's hard drive. I'm not.
No, on the contrary, the contents of it have been very, very fully reported and clearly very accurately reported. I think it is profoundly dangerous because, again, as I'm sorry, I keep quoting myself, but it's a reliable authority, unlike some others. It always leads to... Please, Stephen. It always leads to tit for tat.
That's right.
And this is the important thing. We learned a bitter lesson, right? This is me, historian, though he didn't listen. Me, historian, we learned a bitter and terrible lesson with our own politics from the Middle Ages to the 17th century. If you try to prosecute for alleged criminal acts every politician who falls, you simply get eventually a circle of blood. And there are increasing signs, as politics becomes more bitter, more divided, that we are teetering on the edge of that. We should be warned.
And this is the one thing that will put anybody off going into politics.
Oh,
that if you are prosecuted for mistakes that are honest mistakes...
Or even dishonest ones.
But that if it goes from being... your mistakes lead to you losing an election, to your mistake means that you're hauled up before a court. Why would anybody go into politics?
I think you're right to put your finger on that. Look, in some ways, taking the documents to Mar-a-Lago or taking them to Joe Biden's garage, that could be seen to be an honest mistake. But paying $300,000 as hush money for a film star, and then concealing it and then putting it through a confused trail of documents, that I think is a criminal, and I think that deserves to be penalised.
On the contrary, I mean, as far as one can see, it is in terms of New York or American politics, it's a mere, as it were, electoral technicality. But the problem is a much deeper one. It is the moment you start invoking criminal process. Criminal process then destroys any form of freedom of debate, any form of confidence in politics. The two should be kept rigorously and absolutely separate. But you see, I think we are on a slippery slope here, Jacob, and we haven't talked about the reason. The reason is the Supreme Court. The reason that this pattern has started to develop in America is because with the thing called the Supreme Court, apparently law ranks above legislation. And because thanks to the disaster of New Labour, the importation of that idea into England, we are on that slope. It will be profoundly difficult to resist it.
Well, we can talk
we're
about our
doing the
Supreme
same with
Court.
Boris Johnson, aren't we? But to a lesser degree.
I hope there's not a read across there. But what's interesting, I think, there's a chap called Terry Atkinson who's got a garage on my old patch. And I went to that, he's wearing a MAGA cap. And, he's Make America Great Again. There are some people who are actually being energised and electrified by this, what they perceive as the persecution of Trump.
This is David's point. The person who's persecuted does well. And John Wilkes got re-elected again and again and again. The more the government persecuted him, the better he did.
You look at the extent of violence in 18th century politics. You look at the violence in France. One of the things that has been so excellent about our politics is that despite the intense conflict, particularly from the left to the right, lower than vermin and all the rest of it, on the whole...
1947.
On the whole, and continuous thereafter, on the whole, there has been very little actual violence. And this seems to me to be something that we should be extraordinarily proud about and we should try to keep. But we're seeing this constant push to the extremes. And again, the whole nature of legal process tends to do that because, of course, it is fundamentally and absolutely and irretrievably adversarial. And you're not simply, sorry, Jacob, just to finish, you're not just found wrong, you're found guilty. Now, that is the disaster. In politics, there should be failure and there should be penalties for failure. Johnson, because of his behaviour, lost his position.
The office of Prime Minister.
He lost the office of Prime Minister. That is a sufficient penalty. To try to enforce anything else seems to me to be a disgrace. I think the same is actually true of Trump, and it's worse than it's worse than a disgrace. It's an error for all the reasons.
Your point is fascinating. When you talked about Wilkes, I mean, when John Wilkes kept getting re-elected elected for the city of Westminster. Wilkes and Liberty was the cry. You know, there were mobs in the street, but there was no storming Parliament. And when Charles Bradlaugh went there 3 times, he was elected to Parliament from Northampton. He refused to take the oath because he was an atheist. The whole might of the establishment was against it, but there were no riots in the street. So let's at least agree that there's one thing in this sceptred island that we can be fairly proud of.
No, there's a golden right. No. There are constant elections. No, Stephen, your ignorance is staggering. Well, there are constant election riots.
I was referring to 2 specific. Lord Gordon and the Gordon riots. So we can talk about that as a separate issue.
But you get Pitt's carriage being attacked, and he has to take refuge in one of the clubs in St James's Street. Trump has left the plane. Now he's getting into the car now. I think is that him as we look at the screen, and they're closing the doors as they do, and he carries on having all this Secret Service protection, even as he's about to be arraigned as a criminal.
In jail.
And presumably in jail. That's already been...
There'll be really very necessary.
It's been in the newspapers. They may put him in a military prison if he were to be found guilty and go to prison.
He'll go to Leavenworth, won't he?
And
he'll
there's
never
a lot
drop
of
the soap in the shower.
milling about at these airports, isn't there, as people get in their cars and other people wander around. One never knows quite who they are, but no red carpet for Donald Trump today, but no orange jumpsuit either. But they're not getting him away very speedily. I don't know how many roads they close off for the American president when he's an ex-president. That when he's a full president, they have lots of road closures. So he's basically gone out to bat, and we will have to see what happens next. But I want to come back to the issue of violence in US politics, because the storming of the Capitol was a very important symbol of the hostility in American politics. Doesn't this just make it worse? Doesn't this make people who supported Trump, thought the election was stolen, feel that the whole system is against him, they are determined to get him, and that therefore they are justified in what they did?
I think you're right, but a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump put on his Twitter feed, his own personal Twitter feed, the picture of himself holding a baseball bat over the head of the New York DA. Now, that if that's not an absolute incitement of violence, I don't know what is. He's subsequently taken it down. But what really worries me about this is if people look at America now and they see a liberal East Coast, a liberal West Coast, and an illiberal centre, the Midwest, this country America is actually splitting. It's becoming vociferous. It's actually dividing. Now, that is bad for us. It's bad for democracy. It's bad for the American people. And as for that shining city on the hill that so many of us looked for, to be a great example of the future, it's absolutely coming apart at the seams, isn't it?
Yes, but then equally the same is true from the other side. OK, Trump may have held a baseball bat. You may have seen an image of one of Trump's supporters being smashed on the head this morning
with a skateboard in Huntington Beach.
Now, what we must never lose sight of is the mutuality of this process. In other words, the first people actually to say that an election was illegitimate, well, we all know who it was. It was Hillary Clinton. It was the attack. It was the attack on Trump's own election. And we repeatedly...
Well, it was earlier than that. It was Al Gore on
Al Gore.
Bush Jr.
It has tended to come, in the first place, from and again, the whole business of the hanging chads, the tendency in America to resolve what should be political issues by quasi-legal process is catastrophic.
But we do exactly the same in this country. In elections, we do.
Yeah, but we have a highly specific process for doing it. We have it does not.
We have an electoral court.
Yes, I do know. The reason we have them, the reason they are so specific and so localised is precisely so that general courts are not involved in that process.
Exactly.
And very specific rules apply.
And when the George Bush Jr. matter was decided, the Florida Supreme Court voted Democrat for him.
Of course.
And the Supreme Court voted majority Republican for George Bush Sr., so George Bush Jr. So Florida went with Democrats, the Supreme Court went with the Republicans.
Before DeSantis.
It was a completely party political judicial decision.
In other words, exactly like impeachment.
Exactly like impeachment.
Like impeachment, which of course we found remember, impeachment, like almost all of the American Constitution, is taken from Britain. And it was an entirely political process, with the House of Commons acting as prosecutor before the Lords, and people voting purely on grounds of politics one way or another. And it is catastrophic. And we stopped doing it. We are showing every sign, because I'm afraid American habits cross the Atlantic, we're showing every sign of retreating back to it. I mean, again, it is also the whole business of the intrusion of law into what quasi-law, into ordinary politics.
Oh, Trump's now leaving, so he's heading to court now.
There's some hope. The Supreme Court...
There goes his cavalcade, but I think his cavalcade with quite so many cars is an opportunity to begin to talk about government waste, because throughout the programme we've been asking you about the number of civil servants and how that number has changed since the peak of the British Empire. Here are the figures you've been waiting for. In 1914 there were 4,000 civil servants against 483,450 who make up the civil service today. By early 1914 the British Navy comprised 520 warships, whilst the Navy today has 71 operational commissioned ships. And finally, the start of the First World War, near the peak of the British Empire, the Foreign Office had 175 staff, bear in mind including the doorkeepers, whilst 17,300 staff make up our Foreign Office today, including 280 overseas embassies and high commissions. And the shock doesn't end there. Passport office workers are now striking over, you'll never guess it, pay, pension and conditions. Now, I'm not sure what conditions these sluggards are striking over, as most of them or many of them work from home, but I'm sorry to inform you that your new blue passports will be on hold as passport workers leave their home to enter their own picket lines. This is obviously an important part of the discussion, and I'm now delighted to be joined by Tim Ambler of the Adam Smith Institute. Tim, you've written an excellent book going through opportunities for governments to save money. First of all, could you give us one or two of the juiciest opportunities that there are that could save the taxpayer funds?
Well, I will. I'm happy to do that. I mean, there are 4 times as many government departments as there needs to be. There are twice as many civil servants as there needs to be, and you could argue a lot more than that. But actually, this book is not really about saving money, although that's nice. It's about modernizing government. And the fact of the matter is, the government structure today is a mess. The civil servants are not focused on delivering what they're supposed to deliver. The structures are wrong. The overstaffing is getting in the way. The cogs of government machinery don't work because there's simply too many cogs. So whilst I accept that the numbers game of too many people is an issue, modernizing government is a much bigger issue. And it's an issue which all politicians, all civil servants ought to be recognizing, that they shouldn't just talk about modernizing industry. The people who need to be modernized most is the government itself.
But the government's never very enthusiastic about that, is it? Because whilst I was briefly Minister for Government Efficiency, you came to help me, you came up with good ideas, but we didn't find people banging down my door to be more efficient.
No, and well, what this book does, by the way, which is what I'm hoping people will take a look at, it's called Shrinking Whitehall. It's the only book on the market which paints a picture of what the government should look like. Now, that's step one. Moving from where we are, the techniques to move from where we are to where we should be, with the civil service which will be locked against any change of any kind, and certainly any change which affects them, is going to be extremely difficult. Possible, but difficult.
And you're in favour of getting rid of quite a number of departments. I think one of your more controversial views is you'd like to get rid of the Ministry of Defence.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, that's... of all the white elephants in Whitehall, it's the most white elephantish of them all. There are 60,000 civil servants in the Ministry of Defence. nearly as many as in the whole of the British Army at 73,000. And what the MOD actually does is to screw up procurement, which costs us all a lot of money, and to try to reduce the size of the armed forces so that the MOD itself can grow. I mean, it is the most absurd and unnecessary and Gilbert and Sullivan department of them all. And funnily enough, as I worked through all the detail, which took me some months, I have to say, it became transparently clear that we don't need the MOD at all. And we need most major government departments, but not that one, because the armed forces could perfectly well take care of themselves.
Well, thank you very much. It's always good to hear from you, and I think every government minister should read your book. Indeed, I've sent it to quite a few of them in the hope that they will. Thank you very much to my guests. We're handing over to Dan Wootton, but I'll be back tomorrow from 8 o'clock. And in the meantime, it's the weather, which you've all been waiting for. I'm sure there'll be sunshine somewhere, probably in Somerset, tomorrow.
Hello again, I'm Stephen Keats, and this is your latest Met Office forecast. And after a lovely day through Monday, many places will see a dry and fairly clear night with a widespread frost developing underneath those clear skies. That is away from the far northwest, where this weather system will be bringing thicker cloud and some bits and pieces of light rain and drizzle to the far west of Northern Ireland, westernmost parts of Scotland. Here, not turning too cold with a bit more breeze and the cloud cover, so temperatures 4 or 5 degrees, but elsewhere under clearing skies, temperatures falling away quite sharply after sunset, and there'll be a widespread frost to take us into Tuesday morning. So it certainly will be a cold